Welcome to the Emerging Biotech Leader, where we help biotech leaders maximize the value of their therapeutics from translational development to product launch. We're your hosts. I'm Kim Kushner.
And I'm Ramin Farhad. We are here to help you navigate the pitfalls of the biotech industry and illuminate the path forward.
Welcome to today's episode of the Emerging Biotech Leader. Today, I'm so glad to welcome Dr. Michael Goldstein, ophthalmologist, multi-time chief medical officer in various organizations that we'll get to talk about today. We're going to talk about some really interesting themes, the role of a chief medical officer, a senior leader at various stages of the life cycle of a biotech company, from early development all the way through commercialization, how those various attributes differ between small molecule biologics, cell and gene therapy, devices, various modalities that we might be considering in the market, and when and how we should be considering commercial variables when we're designing early trials and how we're really building our organization. So, Michael, thank you so much for joining today. So happy to have you here.
Thanks, Kim. Happy to be here.
Maybe we could start off. Can you tell us a little bit about your background? You know, one of the things that I found so interesting when we've chatted in the past is you've had so many various experiences in different kinds of organizations. Can you kind of talk us through some of those moves that you've made?
Sure, happy to. So I started my career in academic ophthalmology. I'm a ophthalmologist, and within ophthalmology, I'm a cornea specialist. So first 3 years of my career was at the University of Florida, and then I moved to Tufts in 2000, where I was director of the cornea service up until a few years ago. Along the way, I've done lots of work with small and large biotechs, but really got involved with the biotech industry in a big way about 15 years ago, working with a Third Rock Ventures portfolio company called 11 Biotherapeutics. And there I started as a consultant 1 day a week and worked my way up to consultant 3 days a week. And eventually became chief medical officer as we took the company through an IPO. And there we're working on biologics targeting eye diseases, and in particular IL-1RA, and IL-6 inhibitors. From there, I went to a gene therapy company called AGTC, where we're working on inherited retinal diseases. And I was chief medical officer at that company. It was a publicly traded company. And then next, I was at another publicly traded ophthalmology biotech company called Ocular Therapeutics. And there we were focused on drug delivery, so taking small molecules, marrying them with a hydrogel to be able to extend the delivery of drugs for the front of the eye and also for intravitreal injections. And I was initially chief medical officer there, and then became president of ophthalmology as well as chief medical officer. And took on a number of roles there, including part of my time as in charge of the commercial team. And then for the last 2.5 years, have been at a private company called Emerging Biotech, working on cell therapy. So my role there was president and chief medical officer, and had additional responsibilities over quality and manufacturing, as well as the chief medical officer roles. And that's a company that was recently acquired.
Amazing. So across those various experiences, you talked about drug delivery mechanisms, you talked cell therapy, gene therapy, more traditional small molecules. You've kind of done a little bit of everything. Can you maybe talk about what was the red thread between all of these? Obviously, all within the ophthalmology space, where you're a specialist and your passion and interests have been, but what have been the similarities, and from your perspective, what have been the major differences between these kinds of organizations, given that most leaders that at least I get the opportunity to speak to, they don't have the opportunities in their careers to jump around as much as you have. So how have you parlayed that, and how have you really kind of pulled it all together?
Yeah. So as you noted, everything has been in the ophthalmology space, from front of the eye diseases to back of the eye diseases. Within that space, I've worked from preclinical through approval, through post-approval, with several drugs approved, and then multiple different modalities to get to your question. So I've worked on small molecules, biologics, gene therapy, cell therapy, and drug delivery and devices. So I think starting with what's similar, I think the process is similar. And I'll just back up for a moment. The reason that I like being in the biotech industry, and I should say I also see patients a day a week, and so I haven't given up my clinical practice, and I still like that a lot. But the reason I'm spending my time in the biotech industry, it's really an opportunity to take cutting edge, really cool science and get it to benefit patients. And as chief medical officer, I think one of the key roles is sort of putting that puzzle together. How do you take really innovative science and how do you get that to patients? And what is that pathway that you need to run to get it there, to not only get approval, but also to get to understand the market? So I think that process is very similar for every one of those modalities. It's still the same. You're still looking at the drug. Is the drug safe? Is there benefit? Does the mechanism of action make sense? Does the type of delivery make sense? And then trying to understand, well, how do we get through a regulatory path? Is there a regulatory path, which can be not necessarily the same as what we think about clinically, the regulatory. So how do you actually get it from idea through a regulatory path to approval? And then the other big piece is, how do you think about the market? What's the market look like? What do people know? And I think as clinicians, we have a pretty good sense of, what do patients need? But we have less of a good sense of is what will the market pay for and what will they pay? And I think that's another overarching cool thing about being in the biotech world is you really need expertise from a ton of different people, and you need to work with a whole bunch of different people. And so each person brings a certain expertise to it, of which the chief medical officer has a key role. But no one can know everything. And so it's working with our colleagues who are super smart and can be doing a lot of different things and trying to solve this puzzle. So I think those are the major similarities. In terms of high-level differences, there's a lot. But I think I could break it down into two big ones. One is, and this is obvious, the regulatory path is different. They have different agencies that you go through, different people you interact with. And the rules are a bit different depending on, what we're talking about. But I think in general, what I would say is for small molecules, it's a much more trodden path. There's certain studies that have to be done, certain toxicology studies. There's certain things the FDA is expecting you to come with, and you need to follow that pathway. Whereas if we look at sort of the latest modality, cell therapy, it's just not nearly as trodden a pathway. So there's more flexibility, which is good because it allows for creativity, but it's hard because there's no blueprint. And so that requires, I think, closer interaction with regulatory colleagues, et cetera, to navigate that pathway. So I think that's a huge difference. The other huge difference is manufacturing. So with, again, I'll just say at one extreme, a small molecule, you generally make the drug, you've got the drug, you've got stability, you have the drug, and there's all sorts of get it ready. But once it's ready for a trial, for example, you've got it and you can make a lot of it generally. Right. And the cost is generally low per patient. But as we go to biologics and gene therapy and cell therapy, the cost for manufacturing goes up, the complexity goes up. And I'll just use the extreme example. If we have a fresh product, cell therapy, you're constantly making it. So that whole manufacturing process that takes place essentially once or maybe twice with a small molecule during the course of a trial happens very frequently, every week or potentially even more frequently than that. So that requires all the testing, all the release tests, and anything that can happen with those can happen. So I think that's a big difference, and it has lots of implications on how you think about a trial, because you can't just have a whole bunch of patients ready to go and then start treating them, because you may not have drug available as you do it. And then I'll just say there is a third thing that I think is similar but different, which is the body's immune response to whatever you're using. So with small molecules, there can be an inflammatory response, and generally, but not usually. Most small molecules are pretty well tolerated. With cell and gene therapy, there is the consideration about what's the body's immune system going to be and how's that going to interact and how do you handle that. And biologics as well. So that becomes an additional consideration. What the immunogenic response becomes a much bigger role, I think, with some of these therapies compared to others. And then I guess the last thing I'll just say is if we compare all that to devices, with devices, there's more of a mindset of make a bunch of the devices, test them for quality, make sure they're safe, throw out the bad ones, and use the good ones. And so it's a bit of end stage testing. So it's safe, but a lot of that's done at the end. Whereas I think with drugs, that testing takes place throughout, and you have many more quality controls throughout the process. Or put another way, if you just test it at the end, that would not be acceptable generally. So that becomes, I think, the big change. And we had that experience at Ocular Therapeutics where we changed from sort of a device mindset for manufacturing to a drug mindset for manufacturing. And that we'd had 2 prior CRLs. And once we made that mindset change, which is a whole mindset change across the manufacturing organization, we were able to get the drug approved.
Yeah. Super interesting. You hit on a number of topics that I definitely want to dig into. But while you're on that last point on the manufacturing front, I find it very interesting. The FDA has recently announced over 200 CRLs over the last 5 years that they have given to various organizations in the industry. One of the top themes from those CRLs that were released was manufacturing and manufacturing questions and things that have come up. It's front and center. Though it's incredibly rare for a chief medical officer and somebody in your role to have had the depth of experience in overseeing manufacturing and quality and some of the variables that you have in your background. And it is so critical, especially in some of these newer modalities that are incredibly innovative, but manufacturing is a key component, not just of clinical supply, but is this actually going to work for the patient? And a slight mishap in manufacturing is going to have a major impact on the clinical effect if there is one, or if there's not, or if there's other side effects that could potentially destroy the trial. So can you dig in a little bit more you're a practicing physician. You for sure were not trained on drug manufacturing in medical school. How did you parlay into really overseeing the manufacturing? And how do you think about that relative to the role of a chief medical officer in a growing biotech?
Okay, a lot there.
A loaded question for you.
Yeah. So let me just actually pick up on one point you made, which is that there are a lot of CRLs that are out there around manufacturing. I think manufacturing is underappreciated in most organizations. It's a bit like a referee in a game. Like most people don't notice it, but when it's a problem, you actually really notice it. And, I think it's super critical to have your manufacturing nailed down. And I think one of the errors that happens with CRLs is the FDA will come in and they'll give you a number of reasons for the CRL, and then a company will fix those 3 or 4 reasons and then get another CRL. And I think it's really important to read those CRLs critically because one message underlying them, it might just be that they care about those 4 issues, but it could be that you don't have control over your manufacturing process. And therefore, every time you fix the 4, and then there's 4 more. And that's some of the experience I've had before. So I would say when you get a CRL, be very critical about it and think about, do I have control over the manufacturing process? So to answer the question you asked, you are correct. In medical school, they do not teach us about manufacturing. And it was certainly not the first thing I did in the chief medical officer role, where I was focused on more traditional things. But I think one of the super cool things about being a chief medical officer is, as I said, your goal is to get drugs from concept to patients, and you have responsibility for all those things. And so the first responsibility you have, and this is from day one with manufacturing, is to make sure the product is safe. Because it's you as a chief medical officer are essentially the voice of the patient, number one, and then the voice of the physician too. And in many organizations, you're the only person who has treated patients. So bringing that voice is important, and it comes up in a number of different roles, a number of different ways. But I think from a manufacturing perspective, the number one way it comes up is safety. And so I think that's where your interaction, that's sort of the first part is working with the manufacturing team and understanding, is whatever deviation, whatever issue happening, does it have an impact on patients? And, I'll just give an example. We had an out of spec for a manufacturing product. And the question then is, should we not use this product? And so then the default in the quality team is always, if it's out of spec, we don't use the product, right? Period. But then the question is, that slows things down, and that gets into a delay in time, which is sort of another topic. Is that appropriate? And so then you want to have a meeting and you want to discuss what's the impact of whatever the deviation is on the final product, and will that affect patients? And I'll just say in one example, the out of spec was because the temperature in the room where the operators were working was 2 degrees higher than what was in the spec. But then when you asked, does that have any impact on the product? The answer was no. So if it doesn't have any impact on the product, then, I think you can make a judgment. It's safe to use. Now, so then the question is, it becomes, sort of a technical one. Why is that a release spec? Maybe it's not a release spec. Maybe it's a best practice, and you need to change that. So that gets into another level of detail. But the point I'm trying to make is it's really assessing the impact of manufacturing on safety. And so that was sort of the first role. And then you grow. And one of the really cool things about Chief Medical Officer is you, as I said, work with a lot of smart people, and you have the opportunity to learn lots of new things. And the other part is working with and hiring really good people. So I think the key for a Chief Medical Officer to be responsible for manufacturing is caring about the patients and hiring the right people who know what they're doing, and then being able to have a constructive dialogue, back and forth dialogue, to discuss what's going well, what's not going well, and what impact does that have on the product and ultimately on patients.
Yeah, that is such a critical piece on, is it going to impact the patient? How do I think about the overall impact from the program perspective? And you started to reference this point on time. And there's various considerations when you're working on developing a drug. One of the most important from a market perspective is how quickly can you get the drug to patients in a commercial setting. And often we're worried about, is a CRO going to deliver? What are all the various attributes that we can control? But you made a comment when we first met about the impact of time and how it is probably the most cherished and critical asset for a biotech. Can we maybe dig in a little bit there? How do you think about the resource of time, if you will, within the biotech setting, and how it's appreciated or underappreciated or maybe overappreciated in various settings?
Yeah, it's a good question. So in a biotech, there's obviously lots of critical resources. So people and money and technical expertise. So all super important. But I would argue that time is probably the most underappreciated aspect within a company. And there's often a push and pull between the shareholders or board of directors and the company. And the board of directors and shareholders, everyone wants everyone to move quicker, and the company is basically saying we're moving as quickly as we can. That said, there can be a tendency for things to take longer than it needs to be. And there's also a tendency sometimes to do more than needs to be done. So I think the critical part is doing things the right way, but doing things the most efficient way. Because ultimately, the one resource you can't ever get back is time. And once time has passed, it's gone and you've lost it. And there are huge financial implications related to time. So there's, the burn rate for a company continues. And I'll just make the point that and this is one difference we didn't talk about with cell and gene therapy, but often those CDMOs charge you fees based on suite fees that you pay whether or not you're manufacturing. So usually with small molecules, you're not paying that except if it's manufacturing. So that gets pushed off. But with especially a cell therapy company, you're still paying that suite fee whether or not you're manufacturing. But you're still paying in salaries, et cetera, no matter what, and you're still paying for the real estate. So there's the monthly burn rate. And then there's time to market. So time value of money, every month you're delayed is going to cost you more. And then there's competitors. Every good idea has got a number of competitors, and getting to the market earlier has a huge value. So I think time is super critical. Now, that said, and I think this is one of the things that chief medical officers and the whole leadership team has to balance is internal timelines. So how do you motivate the team to move quickly? And I think the caveat to that is setting expectations appropriately and making sure that you're not over-promising either if you're a public company to the market or a private company to your board, because you don't want to be in a situation where everyone's performing really well and efficiently, and yet the market or the board says that your company is underperforming because it took an extra month or two. So I think being very aggressive with internal timelines is, as long as not taking shortcuts, but setting aggressive timelines, stretch goals, if you will, internally makes sense. But I think being more cautious with external discussion of timelines also makes sense, so that you don't set unrealistic expectations and put people in a position where, like I said, the company's had a great success, yet the board or the shareholders say, oh, no, you were highly delayed.
Right. It's such an important point. And I do want to circle back to a point earlier that you made, that you're in a biotech, you get these great opportunities to work with incredibly smart people of various skills, and that nobody can really do these things alone. And when we talk about the criticality of time and setting aggressive internal timelines and how you balance expectations with your board and external stakeholders, there's also this factor of, do you have the resources to accelerate in the way that you're being asked to do? And often, and at least I have these conversations regularly, that CEOs are under pressure from the board. They're constantly asking, can you do more with less? Can you go faster? Can you do it with less people? Can you do it with less support externally? What would that look like? And usually the answer is no, I need more to do more. And that's, the basic math that we're playing here. But how do you balance that? How do you vie and create the business case for the resources and the support you need when you are trying to accelerate and you're doing everything in your power to get there?
So it's a great question, and it's something that comes up at every company with every program.
Inevitably.
I think, so the first thing I'll say is no one knows the perfect path. And I think there's a huge strategic component, which is you may be on a pathway where you have to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and you need X amount of resources. But I think it's really being critical and saying, do we need to do all those 10 things? And do we need to do all those 10 things now? And there's one of the really, I think, fun and interesting things that in biotech, there's a million ways to do these things, and no one knows all the answers. And you never know who on the team has experience. And so I think this gets to another point, which is you need other experienced people that you can draw on their experiences, because you've only got your experiences in a certain way. But there's often people on teams who have done it a different way or seen a different way. And I'll just say in ophthalmology, one of the neat things is most people come from outside of ophthalmology. They come from oncology for the most part. And the world of oncology is different than the world of ophthalmology, so obviously. But just even the process is different. And so you can take ideas of other programs and other pathways, apply them. And that's one easy way, not easy way, but that's one way where you can actually do more with less. The second thing is, I think people get too resource constrained too early. And, very early in if you shut things down by saying we don't have the resources, therefore we can't do it, you don't actually figure out another pathway. And so I like to start these discussions by saying, let's assume resources aren't a limiting factor. What are the different pathways to most quickly get to market, to most quickly get through the regulatory cycle? And then we can unpack how much resources would that be. And sometimes you're surprised it doesn't actually take more resources, sometimes in a more efficient way. Sometimes it does take more resources. And then you have a good case to go to the board and say, well, if we add 3 extra people doing X, Y, and Z we spend another $1 million, we can actually expedite things by 3 or 4 months. Is that a trade-off you want to make? But it's done with data, not just my opinion of, well, I just don't have the resources to do this, therefore I can't do it. And so I'll just say, for me, like what I like about the chief medical officer role is the strategizing, and it's the thinking about it, and it's the not trying to follow just one path, and it's trying to be creative. And I think, but there are one of the things you have to go over is organizations get very fixed in their structure, and people get very dogmatic. I don't have the resources to do it. And, it's getting people out of that and saying, okay, just put that aside. Yeah, that's an important thing. Like money and people are important for sure. But if we can put that aside, what could we do?
Right.
And maybe we can only accelerate things by 1 month for $1 million. You say, oh, it's not worth it. But sometimes you're surprised. And I would say more often than not, you're surprised that you can actually move things along more quickly than you think with not as much resources as you think.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that answered your question.
It does. And I think you brought up a couple of really important themes that I want to highlight here. On that last one, I think the creativity, and I'd maybe even add to that last point, the creativity around what the actual true problem is, not the symptom. I find a lot of organizations are actively trying to solve for, how do I fix for this? Or I need to hire an FTE to do this thing. And I'm like, that thing is temporal. You only need to do that thing for a month. Why are you sprinting to hire an FTE to build all of this infrastructure that really isn't going to be a sustainable operational factor of the long-term trajectory of your business? Like you're solving for the wrong problem.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important for leaders to take a step back and say, what are we actually solving for? Why are we trying to solve for it? And let's allocate our resources to the things that are going to have the most meaningful, lasting impact to the success of the programs in the company, not just the thing that's glaring in my face today because it's on fire and feels urgent in that regard.
Yeah, absolutely agree. And I think along those lines, that becomes the discussion. Maybe the way you solve this is with consultants, and a temporary spend of 3 or 4 months can really jumpstart things without having a long-term spend. Right. Particularly if someone's got a particular domain expertise that you may not have, or I'll say medical writing is a big area. Like most companies don't have expert medical writers. There's great medical writers out there, and for a reasonable amount of money, you can actually get a lot of help writing INDs and writing SAPs and writing all these things. So I think being aware of and utilizing consulting services is important. In the same breath, I'll say consultants can get very expensive. So you've got to manage them. Like the ideal consultants are people who jump in, they act like they're employees for the time they're with you, and then they move on without extending the role that you needed them for. Right. But I think that's a key decision. Is like, do we hire someone full time, or are we going to use a consultant? And what is the purview of that person, and how long are we going to keep it?
Absolutely. The other thing that you highlighted that I really liked, and I want to just dig into for a moment, is this idea of the team and how you're building the team, and the fact that even if you bring in 10 senior people that have been in very similar type roles before, no one's been in this exact situation. Excuse me. No one's been in this exact situation before. They've never been with this exact team before. They might have worked on a similar asset, but it's not the same. And I think people over-index on, I hired a bunch of very experienced people. They've worked on similar drugs. They're going to figure it out. And they forget to manage the team dynamics that are actually going to make the program successful and the organization successful. Can you dig in a little bit on that teaming piece?
Yeah, I guess the way I look at it is people ask me, what's the difference between a full-time doctor and being in the biotech world? And one of the big differences, it's really a true team effort in biotech. And there's lots of people with lots of expertise that you need to rely on. And you need to be able to interact with. And so it's sort of, but as you said, and the analogy I've heard people use is you got to have the right people on the bus. So you've got to look at the particular situation you are in, and then you've got to hire the right people for that situation. And that involves understanding their domain expertise, but also understanding their ability to think critically beyond what they've done before. Yeah. And I'll just a quick example, like when I got to my last company, the view was that we were in late stage manufacturing, and so we hired someone in late stage manufacturing, but we really were actually in early stage manufacturing and needed to make a lot of refinements. And so we had to make a change because we needed to hire someone who had an earlier stage mindset. And the person we hired was great for a later stage program, but we just weren't there. So the fit for the skill set of what we needed, even though the person was very experienced and knowledgeable, was not the right fit. So I think that is key. Yes, they've been in the same area, but each, as you said, each situation is very unique, and being very critical about what are the needs there. But I think the harder part is going beyond that and saying, okay, how do we get people out of their boxes? And I think that's where a key leadership team comes in, of which the chief medical officer plays a big role. Is the role of the leadership team is to help people get out of their box and think more broadly, because it's very, very easy for people to think about their domain and just a little issue, and getting people to think cross-functionally and working together cross-functionally in a creative way, bringing their expertise. That's when the dynamics are really good. But it's also really hard because people are comfortable at swimming in their own fish tank, and getting them to think beyond that can be hard.
Yeah, to make a bold statement, I would argue that that is probably one of the top 3 reasons why some biotechs fail, is that their leadership teams are overly siloed and really focusing on their own individual success in the functions that they operate in. They're not operating as a team. They're not truly acting as, fiduciaries of the business or kind of owners of the molecule collectively, recognizing that every single one of you wants the same outcome, and you want the success, you want the patients to do well. But the way you're going about it is very siloed in terms of, the function that you represent and the teams that you're managing, which is understandable. You have, 40 people reporting to you that their livelihoods are on the line if something goes wrong. But we have to think broader, and you have to think about the entire organization. You have to think about all of the patients that are going to benefit or not benefit if you don't succeed as a team. And so that's an area that I've seen, unfortunately, a lot of leadership teams stumble, and especially newer leaders, chief medical officers, CEOs, really struggle to build that team dynamic so that you can operate as one unit, that you can recognize, like, I'm going to take a step back here, and I'm actually going to forego additional budget because, my colleague over here really needs it more. Like, that needs to happen more than what I want to happen. And that trade-off is exceptionally challenging to initiate in those leadership dynamics.
Yeah, no, I agree. And one huge symptom of that is what the example you just said. Well, it's in my budget, so I need to spend it, without thinking about, well, if I put it in someone else's budget, maybe it'd be better used. And one of the things I always say is, it's all of our budget. We've distributed the money so that we can have an organized fashion, so that each of you has a budget. But if there's a better use for it somewhere else, then we need to think about that. Now, you can't do that continuously, because then you kind of run in circles also. But I think it's being mindful. Just because it's in your budget doesn't mean you need to spend it. You should, if you need to spend it, absolutely. Right. But if it's sort of like, oh, we can actually do this little extra thing, whereas it would have a lot more value in some other group, people have to be open to that. And because at the end of the day, $1 in the company is $1 owned by the whole company. It's not owned by clinical operations or manufacturing or commercial. It's owned by the company.
Exactly. One last area that I want to dig into briefly today, you started to touch on this a few topics ago, but I want to come back to it, which is some of that commercial mindset as you're thinking about early development and kind of the various phases of drug development, and kind of demonstrating the effectiveness of the drugs that we're designing. Many organizations think that commercial thinking more broadly doesn't really have to happen until late phase 3, or until you get through an interim readout of phase 3, whatever it might be. Obviously, for cell and gene, the phases are a little bit more truncated. But then other organizations are probably over-indexed on that commercial thinking very, very early on, and aren't necessarily making the best decision to have clean, straight data that we can really bring to regulators, that we can get to payers, and really bring to the physicians that are going to prescribe the medicines to their patients. So how do you think about the balance of some of that commercial mindset in the early drug development cycle with the clinical regulatory realities of how we have to design drugs and get clean data that can really hit the mark?
Yeah, it's a great question. And again, I think every organization struggles with this. And I think that the two extremes are, you have a great commercial product, but you can't get it approved, so that's not worth anything. Or you get it approved, but you can't sell it, so that's not worth anything. So I think fundamentally, there are two fundamental questions that you need to answer as part of the clinical development program. One is the regulatory path, and one is the commercial path. And they are, I think of them as separate pathways. I think they overlap a lot, but I think of them as separate pathways. And I think of the priority as first, I got to get this drug approved, and then I got to figure out, and that's assuming, so you've done your market research and you know that there's a market there. So first is you got to get the drug approved, and second is you got to figure out how to sell it. Now, the level of evidence that's needed for regulatory approval is much, much higher than the level of evidence generally that payers need for market access. So that is a critical point. And so I think you think of those as two different pathways, and then within each of those pathways, there's a number of questions you have to answer. And the first one in the clinical regulatory path is this a drug? The very first thing, and sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's not. And then the second one is, assuming it's a drug, how do I get this thing approved? And then on the market access question, there's a whole bunch of different questions. What's going to be on the label, and how's that reflected? What's the population we're treating? What's the timing of when I can treat this? So I think early on, it's good to brainstorm what are the issues. And that's a living, breathing document. Like, okay, these are things that we need to address at some point in the development path. And then you prioritize what those things were. And sometimes it's easy to bring in commercial concerns early on. For example, lots of times there's concern about patient-reported outcomes, and that may not be needed. It might be needed for a regulatory path, but it might not be needed. But adding a patient-reported outcome survey early on isn't necessarily too hard. But sometimes it is really hard. It requires a change in the way you know that the drug works. And I would argue those kind of changes, you wait until later, and you could even wait until, after you file, or you can wait and do it as a post-approval study to expand the label if you need to. But sometimes they're simple. And I'll give you like a really simple example we had at one of the companies, we have a little insert that goes into the eyelid. And in the study, we only did it in the lower eyelid. And so that ended up on the label. And we were able to, but had we done some in the upper eyelid, then we could have gotten approval for upper or lower eyelid. So that was one where we didn't do it as part of the clin regulatory pathway, but we should have, because the drug works just as well whether it goes in your eyelid, and it would have added some flexibility. But I think it's being thoughtful about those things. So I think the two mistakes are, one is not thinking about it at all until it's later, because then you're playing catch up. The other is putting too many commercial constraints on the early pathway, because if you ask too many questions in any trial, you end up with confusing data. And as I said, the first thing you want to understand is, do we have a drug, and do we have a pathway to get approval? And to do that, you need to have data that you believe in. And we all want positive results, and that's what we all aim for. But by the same token, and you might argue the next best outcome is a negative result, where you say it doesn't work at all, we're convinced it doesn't work, and you move on. I think the hard place that a lot of companies get is an in-between result. And, sometimes the in-between result is because the drug, there's some things we have to tweak, but sometimes the in-between result is because we asked too many things, and we had too many different groups, and we don't have a clear and convincing answer. So I think you got to be careful about asking too many things, or per your question, putting too many commercial questions into an early program or even a later program. And then that's the last thing I guess I'll say is, generally when you go from phase 2 to phase 3, you want phase 3 to replicate phase 2 just in a bigger population.
Right.
You don't want to start making changes that could affect your outcome, because it's like the goal of phase 3 is we already know the answer, we just need to prove it. Phase 2 is where you got the answer. Phase 3 is where you're trying to confirm that answer. And if you start changing things, even little things, timing of the drug, whatever, you can be surprised by the outcome. And you don't want to see that. So you got to be careful, and really, if you're going to add something different to your phase 3 program, understanding and really thinking critically about impact, and even small things can matter. And to tie it up with our previous thing, one thing that's not small is changing manufacturers. When you change manufacturers from phase 2 to phase 3, it can matter, and it can get people in trouble. I'm not saying it's not done, and often it is done. But you just got to be very mindful and very clear that your release specs are consistent and that you're actually delivering the same drug, because you don't want to be surprised with a phase 3 result.
Yeah, I think it's a really great point. Everything about not being surprised or sitting on your hands and fingers crossed that everything reads out, but not being sure given all of the different variables that have gone to a phase 3 is probably one of the worst situations you can be in as a leader. And to the earlier point around time being such a critical variable, in that situation, you get a negative result and you're back to the drawing board. The entire company goes under because you've run out of money if you're a single asset early biotech, as most are, or you do have strong conviction and enough capital to keep trying, but then you're back, 4 or 5 years of development in trying to get this to market. So I think it's a really great point. We wind up in the situation where we could have to redo work, wind up, spending millions of dollars justifying to external investors or your board, if there's even a company. And frankly, there's livelihoods of the team that you've assembled that really are on the line. And so when we go back to our earlier point about the criticality of the team, you want to make sure that they're making really smart and thoughtful decisions early on that can get you to that result as quickly as possible and really balance time.
Agree.
My last question for you today, Michael, as you're thinking about these experiences across various attributes of the life cycle, multiple modalities, the different kind of roles that you've had the opportunity to play in your career, what advice would you give to an early career chief medical officer who's trying to navigate, their desire to try different modalities, if they're a little bit afraid to move out of their comfort zone, or they're taking on a larger role? Maybe they've been a CMO, but haven't extended into the president or taken on other kinds of roles within the biotech organization. What advice would you give them?
So I'll just say why I like the chief medical officer role. As we've talked about, you touch on all aspects of the company. And, again, it's this opportunity to translate early stage cool science to help patients. And so that's sort of the mindset to start with. Like, how do we benefit many patients? And I'll just say personally, like, I have a great practice. I love seeing patients, but you can only benefit so many patients. You only have so much time. Whereas if you develop game-changing drugs, you can actually benefit thousands or hundreds of thousands of patients. So I think that's the mindset. That's one. Two is it's a learning mindset. Like, no one knows it all, and you got to realize that. So be aware of, bring what you know, which is you're the person who's seen patients. You're the person who's knows the doctors. You're the person who thinks like a physician. So bring that mindset, bring that voice of the patient and the physician to the practice. And then be willing and then want to learn from your colleagues. And then the third thing I'll just say is, and I think we all get into routines, and I think being inquisitive is super important. And in many ways, not having grown up in a biotech world is actually super helpful, because you bring a fresh voice and sort of asking the why, like, why are we doing it this way? It's like going back to medical school or residency. Like, you constantly ask, why are we doing it that way? And it's the same thing in biotech. Just because it's done a certain way, why do we do it? Why do we have what's phase 1, phase 2, phase 3? Why do we do it that way? And there's reasons, right? There's a certain logical flow. And I think having people explain it to you, and like I said, most people, everyone in this business wants to educate and wants to teach people about it. So I think understanding all those different aspects, being able to learn. And then I guess I'll say one more thing. I think you got to do what you like to do. Like, certain people really love the clinical development part, so get really good at that. And certain people love the clinical operations part and get really good at that. Certain people love medical affairs and interacting with a physician and do that. And certain people love talking to investors, and there's an opportunity to have an external face and talk to investors. So I guess in the different companies, there's just lots of different places where a chief medical officer can play. And you don't have to go beyond what you don't want to do if you don't want to do it. The opportunity is there. The opportunity is there to be internally facing and externally facing. It's there to meet investors, but you don't have to do it. So it's getting comfortable with what you want to do and then finding the role and the fit with the company of what you want to do. But if you want to go beyond that, there's so much opportunity to grow. And like I said, I never thought I would be in charge of a commercial organization, and I'm not a commercial expert by any means, but learning how the commercial team thinks and what their concerns are, and how do we actually, their goal is the same as yours, which is to be able to get this product to patients. They have a different approach to it, but their goal is the same. And so just working with them and sort of understanding their mindset is super helpful. So anyway, I think those are a few things I would say.
No, incredibly helpful. And I think that those all also lend to your earlier points about being inquisitive and engaging with the team and frankly leveraging your peers and leaning into the areas that you really enjoy and making sure that you're designing and curating the role to be something that you can be successful at and you enjoy, but then supplementing the things that you don't enjoy or that you're not good at with other great people on your team that can help you deliver and make sure that all of these various attributes of the role are fully covered. So definitely appreciate that and super, I'd say consistent with a lot of the things that I've heard from others in your role. So Michael, this has been an incredible conversation. I really appreciate all of your insights. And I think that the two things that really stand out to me are the value of the team and the environment that you build and the criticality of time and doing everything you can to optimize in the development cycle. And really looking forward to having you again back soon.
Thanks for tuning in to the Emerging Biotech Leader, an SSI strategy podcast. Join us each month for more conversations with biotech leaders. If you'd like to help navigating the complexities of biotech, reach out to our team at ssistrategy.com. Don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review.